Let me start by urging my colleagues in the Senate to vote against the motion to discharge from the Senate Armed Services Committee the nomination of Colin Kahl for Undersecretary of Policy. You know, this is not a decision that I take lightly. I've always felt that any new administration should have his team or her team, and I've generally been very supportive. When President Biden nominated Dr. Kahl for this position, my expectation was that if confirmed, he and I would often disagree on policy, but we would actually get along together. We could coexist together. But I quickly learned that this would really be impossible with Dr. Kahl. And I don't think I've ever said that about anyone, any nominee for any position that I can recall. My Republican colleagues in the Senate Armed Services Committee, all 12 of them, reached the same conclusion. We opposed his nomination unanimously. That's very unusual. Before I explain why no Republican, not a single one, was able to support Dr. Kahl's confirmation in committee, I want to emphasize how rare this is. The Senate Armed Services Committee, as everyone knows, is extremely bipartisan. Certainly, the years that I was chairing that committee with the ranking member, Jack Reed, we got along famously. We got things done other people couldn't get done. The Senate Armed Services Committee has always been bipartisan. We have disagreements, of course, but Republicans and Democrats on the committee have a legacy of consensus. The national security and taking care of our troops, these are bipartisan concerns. And this is how we've been succeeded in passing the National Defense Authorization Act. The National Defense Authorization Act is the largest bill every year. It's the one where it sets out the guidelines for the coming year, and it's one where we've always gotten along. And we've passed it every year for 60 consecutive years. So it shows and demonstrates very clearly how well we get along. The department deserves a nominee with bipartisan credibility. You got to keep in mind that this position is the number 3 position in the Pentagon. It represents our shared bipartisan vision of effective national security and healthy civil-military relations. Now, this position demands a nominee who can carry out the president's policies while engaging those who disagree in good faith. And that isn't the case with this nominee. And that's why we're faced with this vote today. I also want to clear up a common misunderstanding. Republicans on the committee did not vote against Dr. Kahl simply because we disagreed with his policy views. Now, policy is what that position is. It's the policy position of the Pentagon. This should be obvious to anyone who paid attention to the confirmation of President Biden's nominees for Secretary of Defense, and Deputy Secretary. Both of them, we got through quick. I don't remember a time when any new administration got the 2 very significant positions of Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Defense so fast. We got them in just record time. And there are some things that we disagree with policy-wise, but we supported their confirmations, did what most of my Republican colleagues for one reason. They were eminently qualified. I'm talking about the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary. Both of them were eminently qualified with long track records of bipartisan cooperation and strong professional judgment. I've dealt with both of them for many, many years. In fact, we expedited the nomination to give the president his national security team just about as quickly as we could. Republicans may disagree with him, but we can work with them very well. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of Colin Kahl. The national security problems we face are wicked and complex. We wrestle with them constantly on this committee. What I cannot support are nominees who reduce complex national security conversations to partisan sound bites. For instance, as many of my colleagues will recall, back in October of 2019, Republicans and Democrats disagreed about our policy in Syria. When President Trump announced a full U.S. troop withdrawal from northeastern Syria, some of our colleagues worried about extended deployments. And this is a reasonable concern. But here's how Dr. Call chose to characterize it. Republicans are the party of ethnic cleansing, he wrote. He actually said that publicly. Good and kind people can disagree with each other. They don't have to resort to name-calling and accusations of war crimes. And that's not an isolated example. As we discovered during our review of Call's writings and public statements, he often embraces conspiracy theories. For example, he alleged the Kushner-Kremlin quid pro quo. Well, that way he's referring to the president's son-in-law, and when given the opportunity to correct this type of conspiracy theory during his confirmation hearings, he refused to do it. He stood by those statements. Dr. Call has also a long history of claiming that every policy decision with which he disagrees will lead to war, and thankfully, he's never been right. Dr. Call predicted that President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran deal would lead to war. It didn't. He said by sanctioning Iran's foreign minister, President Trump was boxing himself into a war. There was no war. It didn't happen. At one point, Dr. Call suggested that President Trump might start a war with Iran for political diversionary purposes. That's a quote. This is a ridiculous claim. Obviously, it didn't happen. And according to Dr. Call, the strike on Iranian terrorist leader Soleimani, the appointment of John Bolton as National Security Advisor, and the events of the Korean Peninsula, all others were going to lead to war. And none of the wars came, none of them happened. His public declarations of policy judgment are consistently partisan and consistently wrong. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy deserves as the Defense Secretary's top national security advisor. It requires a leader with sound judgment and even temperament, and Colin Call simply doesn't possess either one of these qualities. Even worse, Dr. Call has a long track record of maligning people that he disagrees with. I mentioned the Syrian example earlier. He's also said that the Republican Party has a death cult fealty to Trump. That's seriously what he said. The bare minimum for Defense Department's top policy position is good judgment and even temperament. Dr. Call lacks both of these qualifications. It would set a terrible precedent if we confirm someone like him for the job. And I have a history of working so well with people on both sides, which is why I can and have supported many nominees whose policy views differ from mine. And that goes with the job. We have someone who's elected president of the United States. I disagree with them on many of the issues having to do with our defense policy. But because I trust that, while we may disagree, they understand that we're all trying to do the right thing for our nation and for our kids and our grandkids. Unfortunately, I don't have that trust in Dr. Call. Confirming him would create a real political challenge for the department over the years to come. Every time DOD lays down a new policy or makes a critical military decision, we will have to wonder, was this a decision informed by the department's skilled professionals or by the partisan conspiracy theorist who happens to run the department? And that's why all 13 Republicans on the Armed Services Committee voted to reject this nominee. And this is why I urge my colleagues to vote against the motion to discharge and urge President Biden to consider another nominee, one who we can work with productively with both sides of the aisle, even when we disagree. And so, Mr. President, I would like to have you consider these things. It'd make your job and my job a lot easier. I yield the floor.